Confronting Iran, it's Donald Trump's foreign policy obsession. He sent his Secretary of State to the Middle East to drum up support. But what action is the United States prepared to take? And what will the regional implications be? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Nick Clark. Reassuring allies and talking tough on enemies. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has been touring the Middle East to try and win support and put pressure on Iran. He's pushing for an Arab military alliance to counter threats from Tehran. The aim would be to curb Iran's influence in the region from Yemen to Syria, Lebanon and Iraq. Pompeo's visit included 8 Arab countries: Jordan, Iraq, Egypt, Bahrain, UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia and Oman. And he had this warning.
The nations of the Middle East will never enjoy security, achieve economic stability, or advance the dreams of their people if Iran's revolutionary regime persists on its current course. America's economic sanctions against the regime are the strongest in history and will keep getting tougher until Iran starts behaving like a normal country.
Well, Pompeo said the Arab coalition would include GCC countries as well as Egypt and Jordan, but he raised concerns that the rift between 4 of the countries and Qatar would affect the alliance's effectiveness, and he called for an end to the dispute.
Today in our conversations, I stressed the importance of unity among the Gulf Cooperation Council members. President Trump and I both believe the ongoing dispute in the region has dragged on too long, and the dispute benefits adversaries and harms our mutual interests. Our nations do important work, and we have important work to continue to do together. And the United States hopes the parties involved will see once again the benefits of cooperation and take actions necessary to rebuild unity in their ranks. A united GCC is essential to the success of the Middle East Strategic Alliance, which we hope will include the GCC, Egypt, and Jordan.
He also reassured his hosts that the withdrawal of US troops from Syria will not jeopardize America's efforts against Iran.
Battle continues. The president's decision to withdraw our folks from Syria in no way impacts our capacity to deliver on that. And you'll see in the coming days and weeks, we are redoubling not only our diplomatic but our commercial efforts to put real pressure on Iran to achieve what it is we set out for them back in May. These are simple asks. We ask of the Islamic Republic of Iran to behave like a normal nation, and the coalition is just as committed to it today as it was yesterday.
All right, let's bring on our guests now. Joining me here on set is Majed Ansari, Professor of Political Science at Qatar University. From Norman in Oklahoma, via Skype, we have Joshua Landis, Director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Josh, if I could start with you there in Oklahoma, let's take a look at a US perspective of this initially. Mike Pompeo's trip, mostly about the Trump administration's strategy towards Iran. Tell us more about that strategy, and then we'll dissect it and see just how realistic it is.
Well, this trip comes on the heels of the Trump announcement that the United States would be pulling out of Syria. And I think Pompeo wants to reassure allies that the United States is very much in the Middle East. It's reinvigorating. His talk was America, a force for good, and reinvigorating its role in the Middle East. So it wanted to reassure Saudi Arabia in particular and the other Gulf countries, Egypt, that it's in the Middle East, that it's in reinvigorating its role, and that it wants to counter Iran. In many ways, the speech in Cairo was a love letter to Saudi Arabia and to allies, both Israel, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf countries, that America would work closely with them and hopes to build a military alliance to counter Iran. And it sees Iran as a malign power. That's the word that's always used, this cancerous growth in the Middle East that it wants to cut down to size.
And to bring Arab states into closer strategic ties with Israel, is that right?
Yes, indeed. Israel is a very important part of this. And as we've seen, as sectarianism and the Iran-Saudi Arabia divide has grown worse and worse, the Sunni states have really closed rank with Israel in a common front against Iran's growing power in the northern part of the Middle East.
Majed, here in the studio, notwithstanding the Gulf crisis, which we'll come to in a minute, is it even possible to transcend traditional Arab-Israeli differences and come up with this military alliance that's been talked about?
I believe this is completely unrealistic. I mean, with all due respect to your guest from the US, it's not the case that Sunni states are closing rank behind or with Israel. It's very clear that the only powers that are doing so are the blockading countries of Qatar, and especially, of course, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. What they want is basically an approval stamp from DC to go on with their project in the region. And therefore, they have offered to go a step further with Israel. However, other states like Kuwait, Qatar, remain at their positions. We know that the Jordanians and the Palestinians are against
But
the deal
Egypt
of the
seems to be
century.
working more closely with Israel.
Yeah, I mean, Egypt has always been working like this with Israel. I don't think there's a real change in Egypt's relationship with Israel. The real change here is Saudi Arabian and Emirati positions that are now more vocal about being closer to Israel. Even the Warsaw summit that was announced, where Benjamin Netanyahu and the Arab leaders have been asked to attend. It's very clear that it doesn't have the formula to get to an alliance between these countries in the region. I mean, how can you actually talk about the MESA or the Middle East Strategic Alliance when there are so many, different positions in the region? Today, for example, Qatar announced that it will not be returning to Syria with its embassy, while the Bahrainis and the Emiratis are opening embassies there. The Saudis have yet to announce their position. When it comes to Iran, it's very clear that you have varying positions. You have the Emiratis and Saudis who are falling within the Trump narrative when it comes to Iran. You have the Kuwaitis, the Qataris, and the Omanis who have a completely different relationship with Iran. It is very clear that Pompeo is facing the same problem that his predecessor faced, which is that whenever he comes to the region, he has to put in his mind that the situation in DC keeps changing and the decisions of the White House keep changing while he's trying to mend relations with the US allies in the region. And it's very clear what happened with Turkey, with President Trump threatening Turkey with economic war if it attacks the Kurds, at the same time that Pompeo is talking about a strategic alliance with Turkey.
Josh, this concept of an Arab NATO, how would that be perceived in Iran?
Iran would not like that at all. I don't think it's very likely to come about, as your guest said, because there is terrible disunity in the Arab ranks, and the fight between Qatar and Saudi Arabia has really thrown things into chaos for the United States, and that's why Pompeo went to Doha. He tried to counsel the Qataris to patch up their relations with Saudi Arabia. But as we know, General Zinni, just a special envoy to try to patch up this Gulf crisis, has just resigned. It doesn't look good. The Qataris are giving money to the Palestinians, and they're close to Turkey. So the situation does not look like it's falling in America's way for unity. The United States is doing as much as it can to try to bring this together, but the enmity is only growing between Qatar and Saudi Arabia. The longer this goes on, the longer the blockade against Qatar goes on, and Qatar is developing new relationships, new trading partners. It's developing an understanding with Turkey and Iran. So this is going to create some real problems for the United States in trying to develop this Gulf unity.
Majed, you want to come in there?
Yeah, I mean, it's, again, I'm sorry to disagree with your guest from the US. It's very clear that the Saudi and the Emirati position is not to come to the negotiation table with Qatar. And Qatar has maintained from day one that it is open for negotiation with the Saudis and the Emiratis, while this does not come against Qatar's sovereignty. It is very clear even from Pompeo's remarks. Pompeo said to a number of journalists during his visit that after his talks with the Bahrainis and the Emiratis, it is very clear that there is no change in position towards Qatar and there is no change in position towards more unity in the region. I think it's very clear who's stalling here and who doesn't want for this crisis to end. This is number one. Number two, it's also very clear that the Qatari position when it comes to counterterrorism is closer than the United States than their neighbors. Pompeo basically said yesterday that great strides have been made by the Qataris and in the Qatar-US relations when it comes to countering terrorism in the region. And actually, while your guest is talking about Qatar giving money to the Palestinians, the US administration just thanked Qatar for their support of the Gaza people, which is done actually in coordination with the United States. So I think it's very clear that in the region here, there is a very clear position by the Saudis and the Emiratis to stall and to maintain this blockade as long as possible in order to make some political gains. And the US is unable, in my opinion, to make any change to that because of the indecision in DC and the problems that are arising within the administration itself that's making it more difficult for the US diplomacy to function.
Right, no doubt about that, Josh, is that this blockade has created all sorts of problems in terms of the Trump administration's Middle East policy.
Absolutely. You know, look, at the Trump administration is facing a crisis in its foreign policy apparatus. We've seen the amount of contradictions going on between Trump and Bolton, Pompeo trying to clean up the mess. But even so, there are many different strands of pressure groups in Washington, all of which are fighting each other. It makes it very confusing to the people in the Middle East to try to figure out who's on first in the United States and who's really driving the foreign policy issue. And we see that most clearly with Turkey most recently, because the United States, the whole withdrawal from Syria started with the president in a conversation on the 14th of December with Erdogan, in which he was very favorable. He said, we're going to pull out and that Turkey can go into Syria. And now he's tweeting that we're going to devastate Turkey economically if they go into Syria. So it's very confusing, I think, for the for his lieutenants, Pompeo and Bolton and others, to try to figure out what the message is. And as your Qatari guest is saying here, Mr. Ansari, this is very it's very hard to figure out what's going on in the United States, and there's no doubt about that.
Okay, so try and find, Josh, resolution in the Gulf crisis. What leverage can the United States bring to bear on Saudi Arabia and UAE?
Well, you know, Saudi Arabia needs the United States alliance. And I think the United States is playing with its, you know, it's blowing kisses at Saudi Arabia. It's protected Saudi Arabia from the Khashoggi affair to a certain degree by the president saying that it's not clear that the king is involved in this. Of course, Pompeo's message was the people who carried out the murder have to be punished, which inflicts a certain amount of pain on the crown prince, because it's going to see inside the kingdom, it's going to be seen as disloyalty. But on the other hand, it is trying to get beyond this relationship. There is talk about trying to clean up Yemen's situation. All of these are monstrous undertakings, unlikely to be resolved anytime soon. So the United States has a lot of heavy lifting to do to try to bring unity back to Arab ranks, because the Arab unity is completely fallen apart over the last, the last 7-8 years.
Majed, tell us about Iran's relationship with Qatar and how that plays into the strategic gameplay, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, since maybe the 1979, there was a clear position by the GCC countries to combat Iranian intervention and what was called at the time exporting the revolution, the Iranian revolution, across the borders of Iran. And certainly there are different positions in the Gulf according to how serious are these threats to various countries. You have Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and the UAE taking very hardline positions. Of course, the UAE changing positions in the last couple of years. As you know, the biggest trading partner of Iran in the region was, and still is actually, the United Arab Emirates, and especially through Dubai. However, the Saudi and the Bahraini position is completely different. There has always been high animosity between the Saudis and the Bahrainis on one side and the Iranians on the other side. The Qatari position has always been that Qatar will not become a proxy state for Saudi Arabia or for any other power. And the position towards Iran has always been based on two main factors. One, that Qatar will not accept Iranian intervention in the region. You can see this very clearly by Qatar's position towards supporting the legitimate government in Yemen, but also supporting rebels fighting Iranian forces on the ground in Syria, and maintaining that position, by the way, till today. While the Bahrainis and the Emiratis have reversed their position towards the Syrian regime, Qatar is still maintaining an anti-Iranian position in Syria. However, the other pillar of the relationship between Qatar and Iran is based on economic relations. As we know, there is the gas fields in the North Field. And the North Field is shared between Qatar and Iran, meaning that there is a great threat to Qatari's economic stability if there would be a conflict, direct conflict between Qatar and Iran. And I think the Iranians also understand the duality of the relationship here. So Qatar, for example, in the beginning of the crisis here, in the Gulf crisis, said very clearly that it does not need support from Iran. It is content with support from Turkey when the Iranians offered to replace Saudi Arabia as a strategic economic partner. But it maintains that there needs to be dialogue with the Iranians in the region. The Iranians are not going anywhere. You know, just like when the Obama administration decided that the only way to deal with Iran is to get it involved in the international economy and in the international world order in order for it to be, let's say, controlled in the region. Today, of course, the American position has changed, and therefore the Saudis and Emiratis flipped the position with the United States, but Qatar maintains a stable relationship with Iran that is based on very clear guidelines.
Yeah, so the American position certainly has changed. And Josh, spell something out for us, clarify something for us, if you would. Why is the administration so determined to counter Iran? What threat does it perceive Iran has?
You know, these are the hawks have come back in. Bolton, and we've got to remember that Bolton, National Security Council director, is just, you know, he was advocating only shortly before he took office for the overthrow of the Iranian regime. These are people who've been seeking the overthrow of the Iranian regime for a long time, and the undermining of the Iranian regime, certainly pinning back its ears. And that had gone out of style with Obama, who was looking to, in a sense, offshore, balance Iran a little bit with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, not pick a side in this fight, and to keep the regime on Iran so that it wouldn't develop nuclear weapons, but to undo the sanctions. Now we're completely reversed that. It's going to be difficult for the United States to develop this strategy, this very, strictly anti-Iran strategy, because not everybody shares this in the Middle East. We've seen Turkey, which now has a base in Kuwait and is reaching down into the region, has, in a sense, formed an alliance with Iran and Qatar, and is a new power in the region. And that's increasingly putting it at loggerheads with the United States. So the U.S. has got a lot of heavy lifting. In some ways, it's good for the U.S. because its friends in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, are getting closer to Israel, and this is developed a very pro-Israel lobbying groups in Washington. Of course, have been pushing the more right-wing groups have been pushing this policy for a long time, and they're big donors to the president himself. And I think as he gears up his campaign, this is going to become an important part of it because the Republican Party has become more and more attached to this line of taking on Iran.
Right. Majed, as Pompeo, he points to Iran's involvement in Yemen and Syria and a great deal of influence in Iraq and in Lebanon. What is the thinking behind Iran's approach there? Why are they so involved in these nations? And why does that present a problem for the United States?
Well, obviously there's a vacuum in the Arab world now with the increased number of failed states and failing states, with the disappearance of the Arab Central States, Egypt, Syria, Iraq. All the strong Arab states have either disappeared from the map altogether or at least become significantly weaker than they were, and their abilities to inflict influence across the Arab world has greatly decreased. And therefore, this is leaving only Saudi Arabia to work as a regional hegemon within the Arab world itself. And the vacuum that's created there simply will be filled by whoever has enough ambition. We have seen Iran with its revolutionary ambitions, coming through the Middle East and wreaking havoc. And now we've seen Turkey that's understanding the effects of this Iranian influence and the effect of the American withdrawal in the region, and is trying to present itself as another regional power that can inflict stability in the region through its partnerships with countries like Qatar, Kuwait, and Somalia, and other countries. And of course, we're seeing the axis, that's the Emirati-Saudi axis, that's trying also to inflict that kind of influence. All this together will certainly represent a dilemma for the Americans. The Americans, the current administration wants to have its cake and eat it too. They want to have great influence in the region. They want to be the global power, but they don't want to pay for it. They don't want to send troops in. They don't want to even use their political power and their soft power in a way that will make sure that all the ducks are in a row. What we are seeing now is that America is losing influence in the region, and other powers are gaining influence. We've seen the Iranians in cohesion with the Russians and in talks with the Turks, which means that the whole dynamic in the region is changing, not for American interests, but for other powers' interests. We've seen even the Chinese coming in now and having influence in the region. I believe that if the United States doesn't collect itself in the region, and that if United States foreign policy does not become coherent about the region, all this rhetoric about being influential in the Arab world and the Middle East will change very rapidly. We've seen how the Trump administration talks about Iran, but to be honest, there is no coherent plan, there's no coherent policy towards Iran, there's no coherent policy towards Turkey or towards Syria or any other place in the Middle East or around the world for that matter. And this leaves American allies in a position worse even than their enemies, than American enemies or the enemies of America, because it's very clear that nobody now can depend on the United States as an ally, whether it be in the Middle East or outside it.
Yeah, and Josh, this talk of American influence in the region is surely not helped by this pullout of American troops from Syria.
I don't think that the Syria issue is going to be a major problem for the United States. There are 2,000 troops there. Trying to set up an independent or quasi-independent Kurdish state in the north of Syria was going to be, a fool's errand. It wasn't going to work. All the neighbors were against it. They were just going to stick shivs in the side of America if it stayed there. Finding a new order in the Middle East is going to be difficult for the United States because, as your guest said, there are other powers that are very wealthy in the world now, and Russia has come back. China is an emerging major power, and all of that is taking on America as America becomes an independent oil company, the biggest exporter of oil or the biggest producer of oil, I should say. Again, many Americans are wondering, what are we spending? Why are we spending $5 trillion? And this is what's catching, I think, President Trump in its headwinds, because he campaigned on the idea that the United States had to get out of these stupid wars, that we shouldn't be spending $5 trillion, and we shouldn't. I mean, American people are horrified. And this is going to put increasing pressure on every president, it doesn't matter who, right, left, to wind down these wars. And there are other regional powers that have a lot of money now, that are major economic forces that want a role. And that states have collapsed. I mean, this started with the invasion of Iraq, of course, and Iran took advantage of this because Iran was able to assert itself in the northern Middle East, and it really has, in many ways, sewn up a new security architecture with Hezbollah, the Assad government coming back, and of course the rise of the Shiites in Iraq. And this has helped Iran become a major regional power. And it needs this security structure, if you will, in order to counter a possible Israeli bombing attack against its military sites and its nuclear.
Okay, Josh, I'm going to jump in there. So Majed, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, just on the Syrian issue, it's very important to understand what the Americans were doing in Syria. I think two things should be put in our minds when we say that there will not be much of an effect of American withdrawal from Syria. First of all, it's about a third of Syria that's controlled by either the United States Army or militias that are supported by the United States. And that area is very important because it's it's called the island in Syria, which is between the Euphrates and the second river of Syria, which means that area is first of all the natural resources are there. The breadbasket of Syria is there. And the United States have been working also as a buffer between Turkey and Russia. The only reason why Turkey and Russia were able, actually, to establish a good relationship in Syria and to establish an understanding in Syria was because there was no direct conflict between the Turks and the Syrians. We had Idlib, and we had the Kurds in east of the Euphrates, Now, with the Americans pulling out, this means that there is a direct conflict between the Russians and the Turks there that might come to exist.
Majed, we've run out of time. Do appreciate your perspective and that of Josh as well. Thanks very much indeed, gents. Majed Al-Ansari and Joshua Landis. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com, of course. And for further discussion, just go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nick Clark, and the whole team here, it's goodbye for now.